Hello and welcome back to our How to Read the Bible series here on our podcast. This is week number 7 and we're diving into the Old Testament. My name is Kyle if you're new around here, and I'm joined today by Sean Brown. How you doing, man?
I'm good. How are y'all doing?
I'm always confused. Like when I'm talking to you, should I talk to them? It's just part of it. If you're watching this on YouTube, you understand.
And it's always Monday.
It is. It's always, especially after yesterday, man. I woke up this morning, my throat hurt after preaching and teaching and youth group and everything else. I was like, I just need to like not talk for a while. And then you were like, oh yeah, we have to record this morning. And I was like, dang it, here we go again. So we are really excited though. We're tired, but we're excited because I really feel like we're starting in this series to kind of turn a little bit of a corner. If you listen all the way back to the very beginning of the series, we spent a lot of time laying some groundwork about what it means to read the Bible well. And then we started laying the groundwork for, okay, here's a healthier way to read the Bible. Here's a healthier way to understand what the scriptures are all about. And we focused on Jesus being the center of everything. And we talked about how from the very beginning of the story, it's pointing to Jesus. If you look at the New Testament, it's pointing back to Jesus. Our lives play a huge role in that. And now we're starting to get a little bit more practical to start to look at, okay, if this is a unified story that points to Jesus, what do we do with some of those texts that are kind of more difficult? Because, I mean, as we were talking about earlier, there are parts of the Bible that's harder to see Jesus than others.
Yeah, and a lot of that is in the Old Testament.
Yeah.
That's where a lot of people struggle. It's easy, New Testament, I see it. You see Jesus, you see the resurrection, you see the apostles and everything going back, but it's Old Testament and some of those, maybe the laws, maybe some of the stories that happen. And so this week, we're really excited. We have Bobby Valentine coming on, and he is a minister out in California. And I've been following him for a couple years on Facebook. I think Mike actually got me connected with him. And he has really helped me see the Old Testament in new ways. And just through my reading and going through this lens that we've been talking about, how eye-opening it's been. And you and I have joked, you're not a fan of Leviticus, whereas I am. And I just remember a couple years ago going through Leviticus with the Bible Project and Tara Lee Cobble. And man, my eyes were open. And I was like, oh, it helped a lot to see it. And so it's real excited about what Bobby brings.
Yeah. And I mean, he's a genius. Like, oh my goodness.
You can tell how excited he is at the beginning.
This is his jam. Yes. Like he's all up in it. If you follow him on Facebook, we're in a couple of Facebook groups where he's at, and he's always posting like just incredibly deep stuff. And I'm like, whoa, okay, like this is otherworldly.
There were a couple of times in this one where I had to just kind of pause and think through. Yeah. It was good, but it was like, okay, got it. Now moving forward.
Definitely have to like go back a few. Like I love the go back 15 seconds button.
Yes.
Like, all right, I need to rehear that again. And just to go ahead and preface you, whether you're watching or listening, this is another one of those like longer episodes. When we interviewed John Mark Hicks a few weeks ago, it was really easy to split that one up in multiple conversations. It was very thematic. But with Dr. Mike Beggs and now Bobby Valentine, it was just really one big theme, and there wasn't really an easy way to split it. So we said, you know what? We want everybody just to hear the full conversation. So just be prepared for that. This one's about 45 minutes long. So if you do need to split it up, try to find kind of a point in the conversation, maybe where it goes down a little bit. But if you're at all able, try to knock this thing out in one big listening session, because you'll get to see the entire story. That's so great. But I really believe that this is going to be one of those conversations that's going to help you if you do struggle to see Jesus in the Old Testament. It makes me think about the Bible that we gave to our seniors yesterday. Senior Sunday was yesterday in the life of our church. We give them the Jesus Bible, and all of the notes in there are for that exact purpose, to point to Jesus regardless of where you're reading. And this conversation is an extension of that. So we're going to cut to that conversation, and we really pray that this is a blessing for you. And we hope that it helps you see Jesus as the centerpiece of the unified story of the Bible.
All right. Well, welcome to the podcast there, Bobby Valentine. Good to have you with us.
Thank you for having me. I am appreciative and honored to be here.
I've been following Bobby on Facebook for a long time. I've been friends with him. I met him one time when we were at Pepperdine for the lectureship and talked with him briefly. And he knows my sister, and he knew my brother-in-law, Don Hames. And so we kind of connected a bit with that and got to talk to him just a little bit. But Bobby is the minister at the Eastside Church of Christ in San Francisco. And you've been there for how long now?
I have been here since 2018. It's actually Antioch, which is on the east side of the bay. So near Berkeley, Oakland, not too far from San Francisco. So, 28 miles from downtown. So
Okay. And Bobby is not only a minister, he's a father and a grandfather. I've been following his pics of his two grandchildren. Let's see, their names are Ava, and what's the other one's name?
Mason.
Mason is 3 and Ava is 1. Is that right?
That is correct. She'll be 1 in 2 weeks. Yep.
Oh, beautiful. Yeah, well, I'm about 5 ahead of you there. I've got 7, so I won.
Oh, wow.
Well,
they're awesome.
Yeah, they are. Yeah, we're going to be keeping 3 of them this weekend. So
oh, wow. Cool.
We'll see how that goes. Yeah.
Lucky you.
Yeah, really. Well, Bobby, we are so appreciative of you coming on, and I've talked to you about this off camera. We have been studying here at Palmetto how to read the Bible. We're trying to learn how to approach the Bible in a very healthy way, understanding that it's not just a bunch of different stories, but it's really one narrative that points to Jesus Christ. And how do we read the Bible in a healthy way? And we brought you on because I know your passion for the studying the Old Testament and really explaining what the Old Testament means to Christians. Because I grew up, I don't know, maybe you did as well. We were taken to Colossians 2:14, and we were taught that the Old Testament had been nailed to the cross. And the way I understood that was being taught is that therefore it no longer applies to us. While there's some wonderful stories, some things that we can learn, we are a New Testament people. And so I viewed the Hebrew Scriptures as being somewhat irrelevant, that as Christians, we didn't need the Old Testament Scriptures. Number one, did you hear that when you were growing up in the Church of Christ? Have you heard that view? And what do you say to someone who believes and who states that, well, the Old Testament's been nailed to the cross, we really don't need to study the Old Testament?
I did grow up with that. In fact, I grew up with what I call I characterize it as a love-hate relationship with the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament. We didn't just know what to do with it. Oftentimes, some of our religious friends and neighbors would say that y'all are the people who don't believe in the Old Testament. And we would say, oh, yes, we do. And we would quote 2 Timothy chapter 3. It's inspired. But then when you're sitting in class, and I was, of course, a teenager or whatever, well, then I grew up a little bit, or you'd be in an adult Bible class, and somebody would say, well, Exodus says, or the Psalm says, and then the elder or the preacher would say, but that's the Old Testament. Or that was nailed to the cross, or we're New Testament Christians, which implied or seemed to suggest to me, even though we tell our religious friends and neighbors that we believe in it, it didn't really matter. And so we just really didn't. I remember one time, just a little story, I went to the hospital and I was visiting a lady, and an elder was with me, and she was near the end of her life, but and I read Psalm 23 with her. And as we got back in my Jeep and was leaving, the elder said, it's a shame that the Psalms are in the Old Testament because there's some good things in there. And which really implied, that this just does not matter. It's really irrelevant. And so even in my own family, my dad would carry around a New Testament because the Old Testament just simply really didn't matter. So I grew up thinking that the Bible was kind of like a jigsaw puzzle. It was actually in a box. And what I wanted to do is dump my jigsaw puzzle out on the table and put it all together. And the Old Testament, or the Hebrew Bible, just simply didn't matter. So I found all these pieces and I put them over here. And then I tried to reconstruct this this Bible so that I would know what the church was, so I could find the true church. But over time, my view kind of changed on that. Now, if it's not a jigsaw puzzle that I'm trying to construct a church, maybe the Bible is more like a temple. Maybe it's a temple that is a sacred temple. It's an exquisite temple. And I enter into a room and I am not supposed to build something. I'm supposed to explore something. And when I go in there, I start exploring and I see that the temple has rooms and they tell a story. And then I go from this room to the next room and that room tells me a story. And then I find a kiosk, and the kiosk tells me where I am, and it tells me which direction I can possibly go. And I call that, the Bible has its own kiosks in it that sort of function like a map and a compass. And it shows me where I've come, where I'm at, and it shows me what time it is. So I find out where I'm at in the museum, or not the museum, my temple. And it ultimately brings me to, in the temple, to the Holy of Holies, which would be Jesus himself. So again, if we think of that construct of the temple, and I know John Mark has probably said this and others as well, we might think of that as 5 acts. Those 5 acts are like a chiasmus. They are creation. They are Israel. They are Christ. But then you got Israel renewed. We call it the church, but it is Israel renewed. And then you have creation, which is creation renewed. And so you got an A, B, a C, a B prime, and a A prime. Jesus is in the middle. That's the Holy of Holies. So this temple, I go in there and I explore it, I find it, and everything is pointing here, but all those rooms are absolutely necessary because I find out that it's actually the story of me. And as I leave the temple, I have a sense of identity, I have a sense of purpose, I have a sense of mission. And really, that is to be shaped by that story, which culminates in Jesus. Jesus himself is the, what's the word I want to use? The story in 3D. He's the story in 3D, and he's walking around. And when I don't know exactly what this means, which sometimes I don't, I can look over here and say, that's what it means. And so, hope that makes sense. So.
Oh yes, yeah, it does. Yeah, it does. So in other words, Jesus is, the word that we've used sometimes in class is telos. He's the ultimate culmination. He's where all humanity is headed, right?
Absolutely. All humanity is heading that way. And in each one of those rooms, we see what God, I'm not trying to be what they were then, but I see what God is trying to do. He's trying to create an Eden community. That's what he's doing. He's trying to create an Eden community. That's what Israel is. That's what the church is, or the Israel renewed, an Eden community. This is what creation, what God intended, and new creation, where we are a projection of the future into the present reality based on that story.
So do you view Israel then? Do you view Israel then as kind of they are God's church? They were supposed to be the light to the world. Often we think of the church beginning on the day of Pentecost, but did not Israel exist as God's church already? They were the ones who were called out, who were to be the imagers of God in the world. To me, that kind of helped change the way I read the Old Testament when I understood that I thought everything began with Christianity. Everything began on the day of Pentecost instead of we are a continuation. We were grafted into Israel. Can you speak to that a little bit? And how does that help us to have a healthier reading of the Bible and understanding that?
Absolutely. Israel is the people of God. We are the people of God because what God has promised to do to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Sometimes I have said that baptism, rather than getting rid of the so-called Old Testament, it actually binds the the testaments together. So when I, a Gentile, accept the message of Jesus, and Paul calls him the Messiah, and we may get to that in a moment. Messiah is not a name, it is a title like president. Okay, the Messiah has specific content. He is another word for Messiah, the nearest semantic equivalent for that in English is actually king. So if you read a scholar by the name of N.T. Wright or Scott McKnight, they
big fans of both
tell
those.
us all the time that the word Messiah means king. So when you accept the king, you're actually accepting the Jewish king. That's why Paul says that he is the son of David. He is the son of David, the son of David, the son of David. And the promise in the Hebrew Bible is that the Jewish king is going to inherit the nations. Israel is this like a first fruits of the nations, that God has come and dwelled with them in order to show them what it means to be human, what it means to live in relationship with God. And as the story goes, of course, Israel failed at that, just like Adam did. Adam failed, and Adam got drove out of the garden. Israel got driven out of the promised land, just like Adam got driven out of Eden. They died. God raises them from the dead by bringing them back, but it doesn't quite reach its goal. And so God in grace, God in Hesed, as the word is in the Hebrew Bible, he kind of gathers them all together into a single person, and that is Jesus. And Jesus is Israel. He is Israel. And God is faithful to his promises to Israel by being faithful to Jesus. And when you get to the book of Acts, God is renewing his covenant with Israel. Acts chapter 2, at least as Luke understands it, I think, is that he is renewing that. And by renewing that, it's not just a new in the sense of it's replacing. It's renewing in the sense that it's raising them from the dead. That's why Peter says over and over in Acts chapter 2, men of Israel, men of Israel, men of Israel. They are Israelites that will ultimately be expanded. It's going to be renewed as Adam is all people. God's renewed Israel is going to include all people. This is Genesis chapter 12. Through you I will bless all nations. Now Israel is going to be blessing all nations, and by bringing them in, so that Jesus, the Messiah, the King of Israel, is Lord of the nations, which, again, Acts chapter 2, then shows how Israel is renewed, filled with the Spirit, and they go out into the world and they are blessing the entire world as the first fruit of the new heavens and the new earth, where all come together. There's no longer male nor female. There's no longer Jew or Gentile in terms of pecking order. Whereas in the fallen world, those were used to divide and build conflict in the world. Those identities, by the way, are preserved in the new Israel. There's still women, there's still men, there's still red, white, black, and blue. Okay, they still have all those.
They don't disappear.
But they are no longer used as a way to discriminate, but as a way to proclaim the wisdom of God. And so Israel, the new Israel, the renewed Israel, is God's creational diversity sanctified and the basis of praise to the world. Does that make sense?
It does. It does. So part of in reading the Old Testament and understanding what Israel was supposed to be, and even when they failed, I think what you're saying, what I hear you saying, is that it's crucial for us to understand, to see that, to read both the good and the bad of Israel, to understand who we are as church, how we are to be. We are to be what Israel was not at times, and we are to be at times what Israel was.
Absolutely. Israel is I often say that Exodus comes before Sinai, Calvary comes before Pentecost, grace comes before faith. Okay, it always has and it always will. Israel is the creation of God's love and grace. And we
Yes.
are part of that story. So we have the same God, which is the God of Israel. We have the same promise that they have, which is the promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We have the same mission, which is to bless the nations. We are the same people renewed. And as you go through the history of Israel, in whether it's Joshua or Judges, and Judges is a bad, dark time, we can see the history of the church. The history of the church is really not much different than the history of Israel. Israel failed the glory of God. They split. They were unfaithful. They were idolatrous. Sometimes they were worshiping Yahweh and serving Baal and Marduk at the same time. We do the same thing. You look at the
Yes.
Corinthian church, and it's called the Church of God. The Corinthian church really is not much different than Northern Israel. I mean, it is just a complete, total chaos of what's going on. But they exist by God's grace. God
Still called the
kept
Church
them.
of God. Yeah.
At what point did they cease to be the people of God in the Hebrew Bible? They were never lost. They were never cast away. Even as God disciplined them, which they did, God was with them throughout the whole thing. So one of the things that I see when I look at the church through the Hebrew Bible is that God is with us even when we fall so unbelievably short that I'm not saved by the precision of my obedience. I'm saved by the faithfulness of God. God is in this covenant with us, and He is bringing us about and shaping us and molding us to be what we actually claim to be, which is the new creation. But when you look at a lot of our churches, we oftentimes reflect the world around us rather than what God intends us to be. So we have this conflict between our identity and what we're supposed to do. And that's where the story comes in. The story keeps reminding me of who I am. And it reminds me of who my God is. And my trust is in Him, who is supremely revealed in Jesus. And it's not in whether I have everything done quite right.
Yeah, I like the way you put that, precision obedience. I think that I was raised, and it may just be how I heard this, but I was raised to believe that precision obedience was required for salvation.
Yep.
You know, yeah.
And I think that what we do, sometimes the way we approach the Old Testament, when it was referred to in my growing up years, it was used as a way to reinforce what I want to call a legalistic reading of the New Testament. So Noah was mentioned. If suppose they didn't have gopher wood, Nadab and Abihu and Uzzah, and so those particular stories oftentimes were used to present a specific kind of interpretation of the new. But all those were kind of taken out of context.
Yes. Ignoring other
all
stories.
along the way.
Yeah.
So when you ask the question, how would I tell this person that I think the Hebrew Bible is important? I'd say because of Jesus.
Amen.
Jesus, the very first page of the New Testament, lets us know that you cannot have Jesus without having the Hebrew Bible.
Yes.
So Jesus has an Old Testament, if you want to call it that, identity. When I say Jesus, who do you believe in? I say I believe that Jesus is the Christ. Again, that's an Old Testament identity. Jesus is the son of David. Jesus is the son of Abraham. All those are specific identity markers for who I believe in. And Paul, even when it comes to Gentiles, did not let them off on this. When you read Romans chapter 1, verses 1 through 4, he said, I have been commissioned or selected or set apart for the gospel of God that concerns his son, that was promised through the Holy Scriptures concerning the son of David, who was the son of David according to the flesh. Now, and he's raised as the Messiah in the power of the Holy Spirit. When you go to 1 Timothy chapter, 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 8, he says, my gospel is that Jesus is the son of David. He died, and this is my gospel. The son of David is right there. So again, Jesus' identity, his mission is an Old Testament mission. His message is an Old Testament message that's, again, focused on him. And when we sometimes don't see clearly what we understand in the Hebrew Bible, we see it clearly in Jesus. And, of course, I think he's got an Old Testament ethic.
Yes.
All those things go back and forth together, where the Hebrew Bible actually keeps me from turning Jesus into something he's not.
Oh,
and
good
this
point.
is very important, because you can turn Jesus into something that he's not, which that's what the history of the church has done.
Yes.
We can have Gnosticism, or we can even have ideas have consequences. Not the Nazis. The Nazis did the same thing. They turned Jesus into an Aryan, and the idea was quite disastrous, in fact. So
Yes.
Jesus has an identity, a message, a mission, and an ethic that all come from that. In Matthew chapter 1, in fact, the whole Gospel of Matthew kind of used that Old Testament to tell the story of Jesus. And it does it not just in terms of quoting the Old Testament, which it does all the time. It has Jesus living out the story of Israel. Jesus is Israel. So Jesus is a special child, just like Moses. Jesus is somebody who was hunted down and his life was in danger, just like baby Moses, and just like the baby boys in Israel. Jesus is somebody who is delivered through the water, and Israel went through the water. And Jesus, actually before that, he went into the wilderness to be tempted for 40 days, just as Israel wandered around to be tested to see what the content of their heart was. Israel comes to a mountain and they receive the Torah. And in Matthew, that's where Jesus goes. After he comes out of the water, he goes to the mountain and he starts teaching. And so this paradigm of the Hebrew Bible, again, that's the story. The story is shaping Jesus's own personal life. And I think that's how our lives are also supposed to be shaped and molded, and bring me, as I said about Galatians a little while ago, when I enter that water, I become a person who has entered that story, and I'm walking with Jesus through that story, and actually retracing the steps, kind of like Jesus does with Israel. I don't hope that makes sense.
Oh yeah, absolutely, absolutely. You know, one of the things that I think a lot of times we do when we go back and we read the Old Testament, I think Jesus helps us, number one, to understand God. He is the ultimate revelation of God, of course. But I think many people stumble today when they read the Old Testament, and you've heard this said before, that they feel like it's almost a different God being represented, that the God of the Old Testament is somehow different than the God of the New Testament. And, heresy, of course, came early in the church because there were those who rejected even the Old Testament in whole on that very basis. How do you help people to read the Old Testament in a healthy way to see that the same God that led Israel is the same God of the church?
I think that's a great question. One of the things we need to do with this is to take the Old Testament on its own terms.
Okay.
We don't need to project things upon there. And we are recipients of tradition that we sometimes are not even aware of. So we have these ideas that the Old Testament is legalism, it's law, it's ritual. And so sometimes we project those on there without even knowing what's in the contents. It's like judging Lord of the Rings without ever actually reading Lord of the Rings. But God, as I say to people, did not decide to be, he didn't decide to repent and be baptized between Malachi and Matthew. Okay. So when I try to help people understand that the God of the Hebrew Bible and
Hmm.
Jesus are the same,
Yes.
I do it in three ways. When I
Okay.
mentioned that temple, and we would go to the kiosk, and it would
Okay.
say, okay, here you are, this is what time it is. Well, when I go there, I remember that there's a lot of stuff in this temple, and there are things that are more important. And the
Mm.
narrative shows what that is. And as you go
Okay.
through the temple, you have these stops, and it says, this is the whole story to hear. This is the whole story to hear. And so Israel did this literally, and the Hebrew Bible does itself. They do this through the story. They tell the story, and by telling the story, they tell what's most important. The book
Okay.
of Judges is fascinating, but it's not the most important thing. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And liturgy also does the same thing. So they came down to three things. I call them the creeds of the God of the Old Testament. Number
Okay.
one is the God creed, which is Exodus chapter 34, verse
Mm.
6.
Okay. Yes.
And in that statement, which happens in the context of right after the golden calf, of course,
Hmm.
Moses says, reveal your ways to me. And God says, I'm Yahweh, Yahweh. I'm a God gracious and compassionate. Uh, and he says it twice. I forgive wickedness, rebellion, and sin.
Hmm.
Okay. Yet not letting um, um, the guilty go unpunished. Well, this, by the way, is something that is quoted over and over and over and over and over and over throughout the Hebrew Bible,
Yes.
dozens and dozens and dozens of times, including when they have problems. So when the children of Israel are about to go into the promised land and they rebel, and God says, okay, I'm just going to let y'all wander around. So in Numbers chapter 14, Moses says, hey, you said you were the God of Hesed.
Hmm.
So the God Creed tells us that God is steadfast love. God is Hesed. That's where Israel believes this.
Yes.
And the Old Testament believes this. And it says it over
Hmm.
and over. So you got it at the beginning of the history of Israel, that's with Moses. You
Hmm.
got it with Nehemiah chapter 9, where he, again, that's one of those kiosks. It's a
Hmm.
prayer. He tells the story. You've gone into a room, and Nehemiah has just come back from the Exodus, not the Exodus, but the exile, and he prays.
Hmm.
And he tells the story in that. And what does he do? He quotes from Exodus chapter 34 two times. You are the God of steadfast love. You forgive wickedness, rebellion, and sin. We are guilty, but you are the God of Hesed. You are the God of Hesed. We believe this. Now, when you go to Jonah, for example, you mentioned
Hmm.
that you're going to be in the book of Jonah. Jonah
Hmm.
quotes
Hmm.
this. Jonah quotes it in chapter 4, verse 1 and 2. And he
Hmm.
says, this is why I decided not to go to Nineveh, because I knew that you were the God of Hesed.
Yeah.
But the book of Joel also quotes it. Joel quotes it, and he applies it to Israel. Jonah applies it to the non Israelite. So
Mm.
again, the God of Israel is the God of steadfast love. That's how the Bible itself, over and over and over and over, 276 times, we find that word Hesed over and over and over. The second one is what I call the grace creed.
Okay.
So the first one is it tells me who God is. God is the
Okay.
God of love. The
God of
second
love.
one is what does God do? And you
Hmm.
find this again in the liturgy of Israel, that kiosk. In this, when you go to Pentecost, you come before the Lord and you bring this basket of the first fruits. And
Hmm.
when you come there, you tell a story. And again, you're telling the story. My father was a wandering man. We went into Egypt, and as a foreigner, they oppressed us, and we cried out, and you rescued us, and you brought us out here because you're a God of love. You rescued us. So the
Mm.
Grace Creed tells us, and you find that in Deuteronomy chapter 26, verses 5 through 9,
Okay.
is something that, again, they had no Bible. This is what they're confessing. God, you are the God of love. That's who you are. This
Hmm.
is what you do because you are the God of love. You rescue me. So the Grace
Okay.
Creed tells me who God is, what God
Hmm.
does, and it tells me who
Hmm.
I am. I am the one who has been redeemed. I was
Mm.
a nobody. I was such a
Mm.
nobody that they were killing our children. The state was killing our children. That's nobody. But you rescued us. That's the Grace Creed. Over and over and over, over and over. You rescued us with a mighty hand, outstretched arm. The last one is the Emmanuel Creed. If God is the God of love, that's who He is. And what does God do? He is gracious and He rescues us. Where does God live? Every Israelite believed this. Well, you find this in Exodus chapter 6. You find it in Exodus 19, that I will be your God and you will be my people. You are my treasured possession, and I will dwell with you. I can't even begin to stress how important this is. So in Leviticus chapter 26, again, you have the language there that I will not abhor you, even though you're flawed. I will not cast you away. I will put my dwelling in your midst. I will be your God, and you will be my people. I will walk among you. You never find that language. Last time you heard that language was in the Garden of Eden, when God was walking with Adam and Eve. And so again, as I said, Israel is kind of like that Adam. And now they are an Eden community. The God of love rescued them. That's the first two creeds. And now I'm going to live with you. Because the goal of creation, not the goal of creation, the goal of redemption is not just to wash away my sins. The goal is to restore the relationship that was lost. And God wants to live with His people. So He marries Israel. That's what He does. And so married people live together. That's what they do. And so the U-Haul showed up and moved God from Mount Zion, not Mount Zion, but Mount Sinai, and brought Him down to live with the Israelites. And so you get the God Creed, the Grace Creed, and the Emmanuel Creed. All three of those, by the way, come together in John chapter 1 in Jesus. Where He says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and He came and He dwelled among us. That is the Emmanuel Creed. God came and He lived with us. And then He says in John chapter 1, verse 14 and 17 and 18, that He was full of grace and truth. Now, there's not a Jew in the world who didn't know what that was. Okay, that, and by the way, if you're reading the Hebrew Bible in Greek, that is the Septuagint, you're going to find that Hesed and Emet are oftentimes translated as Charis and I'm having a brain aneurysm, but grace and truth. Hesed and Emet is the Hebrew words. So that's the God Creed. Jesus is Exodus 34, verse 6. Incarnate. What Moses heard, we have seen. And now He is walking among us, and He is doing what God has done by rescuing us, and He is dwelling with us. And that ultimately also is where it ends in Revelation chapter 21, where God Himself comes and lives in the new heaven and new earth. So again, when Jesus came, according to John 1, He came to make Him known, to exegete the Father. Well, those are those three God creeds. The God Creed, Exodus 34, again, I can't stress that enough. It's like the Mount Everest of the Hebrew Bible. When I'm approaching San Francisco, I see Salesforce Tower there, and it's 1,000 feet up. And the rest of the buildings, you can see them, but they're not even halfway as tall. That's Exodus 34. Israel put God forgives wickedness, rebellion, and sin. That's why we're not dead. We are alive because God forgives wickedness, rebellion, and sin. He's slow to anger. He's slow to anger. And so when we read the Hebrew Bible, as the Hebrew Bible tells us to read it, we see that God is patient, full of mercy, full of hesed. And He uses that word twice in Exodus 34:6. This is God's name tag. So when John comes along and he says God is love, he's actually confessed that in the temple all of his life. God is hesed. That's the ways. So again, those three things connect to Jesus as the embodiment, the incarnation of the God Creed, the incarnation of the Grace Creed, the incarnation of the Emmanuel Creed. And when you
Yes.
see that and you look back at the Hebrew Bible and you say, I'm going to
Mm-hmm.
look for those things, and
Mm-hmm.
those
Mm-hmm.
are the things that rise to the top. They show
Mm-hmm.
me where Jesus is walking in. I don't want to say walking with Israel because we might think that Jesus is literally back there, but he is
Yeah.
what it's pointing to. Um,
Yes.
I hope that makes sense.
Oh, that makes beautiful
I
sense.
kind of
Yes. Yes,
rushed
it
through
does.
that because normally I
No, that was
spend
good.
a week on all of those.
No, that is a great 30,000-foot view, and that's what we're looking for. You know, we're looking for a healthier way to read the Bible. Well, let me ask you, kind of, if you were to, I know it's hard to do, but if you were to talk to someone, kind of give a summary of your definition of a healthy way to read the Bible as a whole, not just the Old Testament, the New, the entire Bible. How would you put that? What is a healthy way to read Scripture?
I'm a big believer in historical context. And
Mm-hmm.
so believers in ancient Israel and in the first century church, and then for 14 centuries after that, they did not have a personal Bible. So you don't
Mm-hmm.
have
That's right.
these ancient Christians walking around and arguing about little details here and there. This is
Sure.
why I think both the story and liturgy are important.
Uh-huh.
The story, like in that Grace Creed, that's what
Mm-hmm.
Israel's worship did. Israel did not read the Bible.
That's right.
Israel lived the Bible through
Mm.
drama, through the festivals. And those
Mm-hmm.
festivals, again, point to what's important. So focus on the
Mm-hmm.
story. The Passover focuses on God's deliverance. You want to know what is important? It's what God did. Okay? Remember what God did. There's nothing about what Israel did in the Passover. Not one syllable. It's what God did. And when you get to Pentecost, again, it is God has been gracious. We were a wandering Aramean. We
Mm-hmm.
were oppressed. And so we celebrate this for what God did. And it tells me the story, again, a different time. So the Passover
Mm-hmm.
is this time, Pentecost
Mm-hmm.
is this time, and God has been with us. And then, of
Mm-hmm.
course, you get to the booze. Booze,
Mm-hmm.
what is it all about? It tells me, well, our ancestors didn't believe. And so we're wandering around in the wilderness, but God took care of us. We didn't even get blisters on our feet. He gave us the bread of angels. He fed us. He watched over us. He took care of us in all of this, even in our sin. So again, that's telling us that he forgives wickedness, rebellion, and sin. Okay, even those who didn't go into the promised land, God still dwelled with them from birth to death. You know, he loved
Mm-hmm.
them and cared for them. So the
Mm.
story is how I would read even in the
Okay.
New Testament.
Very
The
good.
early church did that. The
Mm-hmm.
Lord's Day or communion, that is really the only real thing Jesus told us to do.
Mm-hmm.
I want you to do this in memory of me. I want
Mm-hmm.
you to remember what I did. And when you come to the table, you have a community that is created by the story.
Mm.
And all those divisions um, of the world, male and female, white and black, rich and poor, all of a sudden are erased by the story. And everybody sits at the
Mm.
table as an equal because grace makes them equal. We are all
Yes.
equally guests. And so when I go to the New Testament again, and I remember that those people, again, didn't get to go home after the sermon and say, I want to argue about this kind of stuff, it comes back to look at what God did in Christ.
Yeah.
He has made us a family. It's not what
Mm.
we did, it's what He did. So I think the story pulls us into focusing on what is really, really, really important. There's all kinds of details that are interesting, but I'm not going to argue about them. I hope that makes sense.
No, it does. It does. God is the
not
hero
gonna
of the
argue
story.
about
Yeah. Yeah. That's right.
Because they really don't change the focus of the story. They do not they don't. The story is what God has done in Jesus. Jesus chose the Passover to do this. That tells me that again, this room is connected to that room. What God did back then, he's doing now. And now I am sitting here as a person who has been shaped by that wonderful story as a recipient of God's grace. And that means that I get to be gracious and to be a blessing to those who are nobodies just like me.
That's right.
And that's my mission. My mission is to be a blessing. My mission
be a blessing
is
to call others into that story, right?
Absolutely.
To invite them into the story of God. Yeah, I love that.
Exactly.
I love that. That's beautiful.
So, yeah, keeping the story ahead of you, focus on what is really important. And when you ask the detailed question, say, how does this reflect loving the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, strength, and mind? And how does this reflect loving my neighbor as myself? And if I want to focus that even more, I can say, when I'm concerned about that loving my neighbor, I say, which of the choices of actions that I'm going to do is one that will express mercy in those situations? And I think that's what God does even in the Hebrew Bible. Love your neighbor. And love your neighbor.
That's right.
If your enemy, if his donkey wanders away, and he comes onto your property, I want you to take that donkey and bring it back to him. You know, that's what I want you to do, because that's an act of mercy, an act of love, actually.
Yeah.
So
we are to be compassionate just as our God is compassionate, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah. I read somewhere that compassion is the word that's used most to describe God in the Old Testament. Compassionate. Is that right?
It is a powerful word, too. It's a word that related to mercy. Like, it comes from a word for the word womb. It's almost like a feminine image for God, I mean, some people don't think about that. But definitely God has those characteristics within him in the Hebrew Bible. He gave, as he says in Deuteronomy chapter 32, that I have given you birth. That is something that I've never done, but the table where the story focuses recreates a world that is different than the world out there.
Yeah.
We are one at the table because we have received the grace of that God who is incarnate in Jesus, who brings us into relationship with himself.
Yes.
But not only us, but all of creation, because God loves it.
He is the culmination of every promise of God, yes.
Absolutely.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful. Well, Bobby, I want to thank you so much. This has been very good, very enlightening. I know that people are going to be blessed by watching this, and thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us and being here on this podcast. And hopefully, Lord willing, we'll have you back again sometime.
Well, I hope it was. I hope it was a blessing. And
and Lord willing, I'm going to see you at Pepperdine here in a few days.
Absolutely, absolutely. I would love to have a cup of coffee.
I'm looking forward to seeing you, man. God bless you. Thank you so much.
Blessings on y'all.